Okay. Well, hello. It's Tom Jenkins here from ETOA. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Carolyn Asante, the CEO of SYTA. Carolyn's been there for 11 years. For many of you, that's quite a long time. For some of us, it's quite a short time, but I think we can draw a veil over that. Carolyn, you prepared a slide deck for us, and I think it would be great if you could talk us through it.
That sounds great. Thank you, so Tom, for having me join you this afternoon. And I'm excited to have an opportunity to share with those attending the marketplace some research and data about the student market that'll really help us, I think, recover, especially as borders are opening and mandates are changing. So just a little bit to get started. Certainly, thank you, Tom. I am Carolyn Asante. I'm the CEO of SYTA and the SYTA Youth Foundation. And we are based in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. As an organization, we have about 700 members. 130 of those are student tour operator companies. We represent members in over 30 countries. And our main goal really is to promote student travel. Getting kids on the road is a priority for us. And we appreciate this partnership with ETOA to bring to the forefront how important student travel is to our entire industry. Now, I'd like to touch first a little bit pre-pandemic. And the reason why I think it's important to look there is it will be a way for us to benchmark how our industry is recovering through the pandemic. And so just put together some stats for you about the student market. It's an $185 billion industry. And if you look at all global tourism, the student travel market represents about 24% of that, which is a really large number. The school group sector, which we'll be focusing on primarily today, is about 12% of that sector. And I put down that our members alone, SYTA members, moved about 3 million plus students prior to the pandemic. And we also track the motor coach industry in North America because that's primarily how many of the students travel. And over 65% of their passengers are students under the age of 18. So it's clearly a very large market. I wanted to show you sort of the age breakdown, and this is global information that really that sweet spot of students traveling is around 15 or 16 years old. Middle school, high school ages, it's generally their first experience traveling, their first time away from home. But what I do like to share is that prior to the pandemic, we were finding that the 10 and the 11-year-old markets were growing, much of that in the language area, and a lot of that Asian students traveling to Europe as well as to North America. So the kids are traveling, they were traveling at a much younger age. Parents were investing in these travel experiences. And we were forecasting going into 2020 to have probably the largest year ever for global student travel in this market sector, and then the pandemic. But this is also just to give you a little bit of information about the sending groups and the size of the agencies, the number of agents who were sending students prior to the pandemic, and then the actual number of students they represented. As an organization, we're committed to collecting global data, but again, wanted to share with you what this looks like because we anticipate getting back to these numbers in 23 and 24. Prior to the pandemic, we did a study as to what were the destinations that students were traveling to. And as you can see, the UK is a top destination, the United States, Canada, but Europe overall is a primary destination for students. A lot of that has to do with whether or not they're studying English as a language, French, Italian, but also more importantly, many of them are studying history. So for US students traveling to Europe, it's primarily based around educational travel and music travel. Now, when I mentioned English-speaking countries, there was a bit of a competitive nature globally for capturing the English language travel. The United States, Great Britain, Canada, Ireland, and Australia were leading. And actually, prior to the pandemic, Ireland was taking the lead in terms of the number of students traveling to Ireland. And they actually have bounced back quite quickly and really are making a play and are excited to get back students who are coming primarily to practice their English. Now, in 2020, we looked back at 2019 and wanted to give you what was the perspective we had looking back right into the pandemic, and especially from an international perspective. Now, when we surveyed student operators, and again, these are operators globally, when they were looking back at 2019, really in the early stages of the pandemic, look at the numbers and what was dropping in terms of the number of students that were not traveling with what they had forecasted in 2019. And they were anticipating really not even seeing a lot of international travel in 21. So the forecast was relatively pessimistic at that time. When we asked them about the years for recovery, you can see what it looked like for 21, anticipating that 40% of that travel would have been back in 2022, and then 77% in 23. And what I'd say that, again, this was in late 2019 when we did the survey, early 2020, and they were hoping that in 2022, we would have seen more of a recovery. But as we all know, what happened in 21, variants and changes to the marketplace again. And also what they were anticipating for 21 that they would have been booking 50% new trips. So they would have been canceled trips moved forward, but more importantly, we were forecasting new travel for 2021. In terms of international plans, you can see that 67% of them were saying that most of their trips had canceled. And again, they were hoping again for 22 and 23 recovery. When we asked them about the destinations that they thought they would be traveling to and what the percentage decreases are, you can see that when we were talking in 2019, early 2020, these were the changes in the actual destinations that they were forecasting. And what was interesting is that we were anticipating greater growth for Canada and Ireland, as I mentioned earlier, and the United States. And that might have been an outlook that they were going to be more open, potentially that business would be back again in those countries and it might be more accessible to travel at that time. Now, the 2021 study looks at what happened actually in 2021 and 2020. And what I have to share with you are some preliminary data. We've not completed the study. That should be out completely in March. But I think there are some interesting things to share with you about travel. So from a domestic perspective, and the reason why I'm focusing and sharing with you some data about specifically the domestic area is because the United States led the world in actual students traveling again. We were open earlier, as many as you know, we had more states that were open. We had quite a lot of differences across the United States. But in terms of destinations that were open, what we were forecasting was that these were the destinations students would be traveling to in 2020 and early 2021. When it came to North America, anticipating travel to Canada, these were the destinations that were on the books. But what actually happened was that in 2021, the top destination was Orlando and Florida. And as many of you know in the news, that's what was there, is they were open very early. So even though New York City may have been a top destination and a preferred destination, we actually saw more students traveling to Orlando, Boston, and Nashville. And as many of you know, that was related to the mandates. Washington, D.C. was more open at the beginning of 2020, 2021, but then they also incorporated mandates which changed travel to those destinations. When we looked at 2022, the numbers continued for Florida, but we also saw travel to Tennessee, Texas, and then Branson, Missouri. And again, sharing this information with you because what we're doing is collecting data about how students were able to travel in the US. And then we're sharing that data with our international counterparts and international tour operators who are just starting to get students on the road. And we're sharing with them how they can travel safely, how the COVID mandates impacted student travel, what were some of the changes we saw in travel that can help them get European students traveling again, as well as Canadians. Now, interesting enough, for the travel that we had on the books, and I think this is what we're going to find from the international student operators when we get their data, is that the number of postponements starting to drop. So you saw that in 2020, 32% of that travel was postponements, 21, 17%, but actually we've seen that in 2022, 50% of the travel that was booked is actually new business. So trips that were not on the road in the past, which is actually a great perspective to have as we want new travel coming back and students traveling again. Now, what does this mean as a result of the pandemic, and what are some of the changes we saw in travel? Well, right now, certainly suppliers, meaning that the availability of partners, we had a lot of challenges with attractions, restaurants, and hotels actually being open. It's taking us longer to plan our trips, and I think you're going to see for international travel, it's going to have a longer window for planning those trips. We're seeing price increases, certainly as a result of the markets. Some of the things that we're seeing around itineraries, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're still seeing a good bit about COVID safety measures. And what I mean by that is many of the schools are requiring us to have plans in place, which means that you as a supplier partner in an attraction or a destination, it's still very important that your COVID mandates, anything that's impacting travel to your destination is going to be important. I can't tell you enough how important it is to have your websites current and to have current information available for tour operators who are trying to book your destination. It is so challenging to have to dig deep into every destination to figure out who's open, what are the mandates, who can travel. So it's really important as you start to open up to know what your suppliers are saying about the mandates or restrictions for booking them. And then we're just seeing lots of last minute changes. It's taking us 3 and 4 times longer to actually book a trip than it did in the past. Now, actually, in looking at partners, as I mentioned before, there are going to be some changes. They're going to be looking for working with partners who are recommended by colleagues who have maybe had some students traveling, that they have a good track record of safety. And again, that's really important to have on your websites as part of your company culture. We're seeing a tremendous increase in travel insurance. Today, certainly North American travelers are aware of travel insurance and are using it, and it is now part of every trip we book. It was always important for international travel, but we're seeing an increase there, and that's good. It means that the schools and the parents and the teachers are more aware of it. I think also we're going to see more partnerships with the airlines, and then more about consumer protection. So some things very specifically for the marketplace, we saw smaller group sizes, and I can anticipate that you're going to see that as well. There are more stops on an itinerary. So what that means is they're looking for more outdoor places to eat, to stop. That's been a challenge over the last year as we've got this sense that we need more parks, more botanical gardens, more opportunities to sit outside and engage. Whereas before we might have spent more time on the bus, more time on the road, more time inside of a museum or a destination. And then again, we're seeing a lot of changes to contracts around deposits, refunds, and cancellations. One thing that did come out of the process, and I think this is a silver lining to share, is that we have done quite a bit around educating school boards, teachers, parents, everyone as to what goes into the trip planning process. And this infographic, simple as it may be, was really important to helping everyone understand what goes into booking a student travel trip, what goes into building an itinerary, and more important, where partners fall in the trip planning process. And I hope this helps you as well better understand how student operators book a trip. Many of the operators are using this information to make the trip more transparent and make it easier to get students back on the road. And I do want to share that this PowerPoint will be available afterwards, and we have additional research on our website. The one thing that I do want to end with, and which is very interesting, one of the challenges we've been finding in student travel is just getting teachers and administrators to approve student trips. And they all appreciate the value and the impact that travel has on students traveling. So no one right now is questioning that kids really need to get back on the road. And as you can see by this impact study, how important it is for kids to travel. what is holding back and some of the barriers, and Tom and I are going to talk more about it in just a little bit, is the understanding of how to make travel accessible and how we make it possible for them to feel comfortable booking those trips. But what is the good news is that everybody believes travel is important for students. Just a little plug, we've got our own annual conferences coming up. We're excited to be face-to-face again. And if any of you are interested in participating in any of our conferences, we welcome you. And here's my contact information. And I'll finish this part of the presentation now. And Tom, look forward to chatting with you.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. That was an exhaustive and comprehensive presentation. You know, we were, let's face it, I mean, the big thing that we're facing is we're coming out of the worst crisis anybody has experienced in their professional history. I think, what do you think is the greatest challenge we're facing?
I think the greatest challenge right now is just a comfort level, as I mentioned earlier, with teachers, educators, administrators. There is this sense now that they're afraid to sign the paperwork because, as you saw, we had Delta and Omicron, and we had just started traveling again. We rebooked, we had them committed, and then we had to pull back again. So I think there's a hesitancy, and that is something that we're going to have to reassure everyone. And for everyone who's on the call or part of the marketplace, it's really all of us chatting with our own schools, our kids' teachers, our administrators. We really need everyone to talk about how important it is for kids to get back on the road. And it's not just a travel industry perspective. Can you imagine that it'll have been almost 2 full years, maybe 2.5, before a student has actually traveled? And it will impact their accessibility to universities. It will impact their educational perspective and the opportunity for them to see the world. And so it's important.
Right. I mean, that's a really good message. Not traveling to Europe destroys lives. This is what you need.
It does. Makes a difference.
No, I mean, that's certainly an impact that we need to try and have in market. Is there anything suppliers could be doing to easing the way for people? I mean, is there anything specific you're looking for from suppliers?
So what we've heard from many of the operators is, you know, certainly many of our supplier partners, we appreciate that you've had cutbacks and shortages, you've had staff layoffs. And one of the challenges we're having right now is certainly staff answering the phone, responding to the inquiries. As I mentioned earlier, it's taking almost a week for us to get callbacks from hotels and attractions and destinations. So, you know, really helping us responding to inquiries as much as you can. Again, everybody understands. As I mentioned earlier, having your hours of accessibility, your whether or not your restaurant is open, you know, what your booking policies, any mandates. If your website and your information can be up to date, then the top tour operators can go to your sites and see better what it would be like to book your attraction. It's that not knowing, are you open? Are you serving? Are you taking groups that are really the challenges? So being sensitive to sharing the information as you have it through your websites and social media, that's really important.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I get that. I think you put that across really well. I suppose, I mean, my last question really is that you've been there 11 years. What's the biggest change you've seen in the last 11 years from a student tour operator point of view?
I would say is technology, and it in a number of ways. As we laughed about earlier, we used to collect their phones and put them in a basket, and we thought that if the kids had their phones, then they weren't looking up and paying attention. But what we've seen over the years is technology and the phones have actually really helped students experience the destination. They are engaging on the websites before they get there. While they're in destination, or maybe they're at the Louvre, they're looking up a photo, they're learning more about the painter. We've seen a lot of the attractions incorporate apps and games into the experience so that it's a much more interactive opportunity. The kids are remembering more, but I think what I'm really seeing is they are capturing their own stories. They're taking pictures, they're posting it to social media, they're talking about it. And what it's doing is it's generating more excitement for other kids to travel. And so I think we have to embrace it. From the tour operator side, we're seeing more transactions through technology and mobile apps, making direct reservations with tour operators, a lot less paperwork, which can be a good thing. And so I think it's getting our businesses into the 21st century. So I'd have to say technology has been the greatest change.
No, I think you've covered it. I mean, I think that's almost what you've done is you've covered three areas in answer to my questions, which we could easily have a lengthy discussion on. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But Carolyn, thank you so much for taking the time to sharing what you've done with us. And I look forward very much to working more closely with you in future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great marketplace.
Indeed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Sophie, that's the cut.